Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome to parts 1B and C in the series Woman Know Thy Worth. We are in the book of Ruth, and the purpose of this is to kind of boost self-esteem of women, girls, preteen, teenagers, young women, middle-aged women, mature women, and to remind us that we have value, self-worth, and we have a God-given purpose. That's the reason why we are here. And just to recap, our first 1A session, we discussed Ruth chapter 1, verses 1 through 9. Hopefully by now you have either read or listened to the entire first chapter of Ruth. We're going to do a quick recap of the first 9 verses just to catch up, and then we're going to go into the remainder of the chapter. And so the chapter begins with a gentleman by the name of Elimelech, and his wife Naomi, and 2 sons, Mal and Chilion, who were Israelites who lived in Judah, migrated to Moab because there was a famine in Israel. And this was occurring during the time when Israel was being ruled by judges. And while they were in Moab, Elimelech died and left his wife Naomi a widow. Then the 2 sons, Mal and Chilion, grew up, married Moabitess women whose names were Orpah and Ruth. And Ruth is who we're going to study in depth for the next several sessions. And after about 10 years, Mal and Chilion also died, leaving their young wives widows. And word finally reached Naomi that the famine in Israel had ended, and of course she wanted to go back to her homeland. And so she discussed this in verse 6, that she was going to return back to Israel since the famine had ended. And in verse 6 it mentioned that the famine ended in Israel when the Lord visited Israel. And we know that during the time of the judges, Israel would go for years when they would be disobedient to God. They would break the commandments, namely, do not worship other false gods before God. And because they were cohabitated or coexisted with other nations who did not serve the true and living God, they began adopting what other nations were doing and started doing idol worship. And so God would leave them. They would have no edge of protection around about them, and so the enemies would defeat them. And so they end up having a famine in Israel. They cried out to God, like most of us when we're having problems at the time that we remember to pray. So they cry out to God. God visited them, and the famine ended. And you might ask, well, how can God visit me? How can God visit my family? We all have certain challenges, some bigger than others. Some people, their children are on drugs or doing other illicit activities. And you didn't raise your children that way. But that's the way they seem to be acting after they reach a certain age. And you ask, well, how can God visit me and turn around things in my family, turn around things at my job, turn around things in my professional life, my personal life? And the answer is prayer. In the book of Isaiah, he said, come, let us reason together. And, whatever our needs are, God, and God knows our needs. God knows exactly what we need, but we still have to ask. He said, if we ask, we shall receive. If we seek, we shall find. If we knock, the door shall be opened unto us. And so, when we seek God, when we pray, when we read our Bible, when we meditate upon His words, then, He will, talk back to us through His word, and as we meditate, upon Him. So, Ruth and Orpah wanted to go back to Israel with Naomi. Naomi made it clear that they should not feel compelled to return to Israel with her. Seeing, for them to do that, they would have to leave their family, their culture, and everything that they know. And so that was verse 9. Now we're going to pick up on verse 10. And in verse 9, before, while she was discouraging them from returning back to Israel with her, she also blessed them and hoped that they would find new husbands, because these were still young women. So in verse 10 and 11, and they said unto her, surely they, meaning Orpah and Ruth, surely we will return with thee unto thy people. And Naomi said, turn again, my daughters, why will you go with me? Are there yet any more sons in my womb, that they may be your husbands? And remember, in these days when a husband died, if his widow didn't have any children, then his younger brother, if he has a younger brother, would have to marry this widow, and whatever children they have, those children would be the sons of the deceased brother. And so Naomi, being an older woman, even though the Bible doesn't tell us what her age is, she was no longer in the childbearing age category. And so she was telling her daughters, I'm not able to make any more sons. And so, and even if I do, by the time they grow up to be adults, you will be too old to have children. So she was encouraging them to stay in Moab and find new husbands. And verse 12 said, turn again, my daughters, go your way, for I am too old to have an husband. If I should say I have hope, and I have an husband also tonight, and should also bear sons, would he wait for them till they were grown? Would you stay from having husbands? No, my daughters, it grieves me much for your sakes that the hand of the Lord is gone out against me. So Naomi, she lost her husband, lost her two sons. So the only family she has left is her two daughters in law. And so she was pretty much having a pity party, understandably so. And so that's why she said that, the Lord is gone out against her. And so Orpah and Ruth, they lifted up their voices and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth cleaved unto her. So Naomi managed to convince one of the daughters-in-law that the right thing to do was to go back home. And as we're going to see later, Ruth's determination to stay with Naomi paid off dividends many times over for her. And even though Naomi was a mature woman, sometimes, when we get advice, it's not necessarily the best advice for us, even though the deliverer of that advice might be somebody who is mature, somebody who may be your mentor, somebody who you respect and you look up to. Always, whatever decision that we make, we have to be directed by God. And that's one of the things that was special about King David. Whatever decision needs to be made, he always thought God's direction first. And some of us, including myself, you think you're intelligent, you have a high IQ, and you kind of reason out things that if it makes sense, you can go with it. And we forget to seek God's direction until we get into trouble. Then we try to put it at his feet. And because he's merciful, he allows us to do that. But, whenever we get advice, instead of just running with the advice, always seek God's face to make sure that that advice is appropriate for us. And timing is important. Sometimes the advice is appropriate, but it's not the right time. And so it's important for us to always seek God's direction, regardless of who is providing the advice. And so now we're at verse 15. And Naomi said to Ruth, thy sister-in-law is gone back unto her people and unto her God. Return thou after your sister-in-law. And this is a well-known verse, verse 16. And Ruth said, entreat me not to leave thee. So don't beg me, don't force me to leave you, or to return from following after you. For where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. And this is a very instrumental verse. It's the turning point in Ruth's life, because it tells us that she was now totally sold out. She loved Naomi with a deep love, and she was willing to leave her mother, leave her culture, leave the religion that she knew, to go to a country to reside where she had never been to, and to worship another God that she was not familiar with. And she has pretty much adopted Naomi's family. She said, your people are my people, your God is my God. Wherever you go, I am going to go. And as you can see, Ruth will be blessed tremendously for this decision. So despite the pleading of Naomi to return back to her people, Ruth went against that advice from her mother-in-law, and it turned out to be a great blessing for Ruth. And we have to realize that in order for us to get, supernatural blessings, then we have to be totally sold out to God. And the reason why Ruth was able to make such a commitment to Naomi is because she loved Naomi very much. And in our lives and our relationship with God, in order for us to be totally sold out to God, we have to truly love God from the depth of our hearts. And I believe I wrote down a reference in St. Matthew 22, verse 37 and 38. Jesus reminds us that we should love the Lord with all our hearts and with all our souls. And in order for us to really sell out to God, we really have to find ourselves in that position where we truly, truly love God. Because you're gonna have instances where you're gonna have certain tests to see, how much you really love God. And, our goal should always be, regardless of what decision that we make, that our decision should be pleasing to God. As long as God is pleased, then everything will fall into place. And, and we see that when we are totally sold out, another example that came back to me as I was studying this chapter is with Caleb. Caleb and Joshua went along with 10 other spies to spy out the promised land. And when they returned back to Moses, 10 of the spies says, oh my God, those people living in the promised land are giants. We cannot defeat them. And both Caleb and Joshua said that, we are able. And, Joshua became the successor of Moses. When Moses died, Joshua was the one who took his place as leader of the Israelites and led the people to the promised land. And while Caleb was able to get his own inheritance, and that's because, of his faithfulness and that he was totally sold out to God. So verse 17 said, where you die, I will die. Where you are buried, I will be buried. The Lord do to me and more also, if anything but death part us. This sounds almost like a marriage promise. What they say, till death do us part. It's a vow that she made to Naomi that regardless of what happened, the only thing that can separate us is death. And that is a serious vow. There's a verse, I think there's a verse, I can't tell the reference right now, that says it's better not to make a vow than to make a vow and break it. Because our word is bond. I know in this day and age, everything has to be signed on the dotted line because people's words can no longer be trusted. We just say things, and sometimes we say things at the time we are saying we know that we are lying, but we say them anyway. But we should learn that, whether it's written down on a piece of paper, yes or no, when we make a promise, when we make a vow, we need to do our endeavor best to keep that promise, and that vow. So verse 18, when Ruth saw that she was steadfastly minded to go with her, then she left speaking unto, so when Naomi saw that Ruth was determined, she just gave up. She stopped forcing her to return to her family. So verse 19, so the two of them, both Naomi and Ruth, went until they came to Bethlehem. But remember, that this is where Naomi lived before she had immigrated to Moab. And we know that as we study this book of Ruth, that Jesus came down through the lineage of Naomi and Ruth, and he was born in Bethlehem of Judah, the hometown of Naomi. And so when they came to Bethlehem, the people that were there recognized Naomi, and they welcomed her. And in verse 20, she said to them, "Don't call me Naomi anymore. Call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me." You know, there's one of my favorite verses in Romans chapter 8, verse 28. And it says, "All things work together for good to them that love God, to those who are the called according to his purpose." And, you know, sometimes we have certain things happen to us and we ask God, why is this happening to me? I've been a good person. I've been paying my tithe and offering like I'm supposed to. I've been helping my neighbors like I'm supposed to. I haven't harmed anyone, you know, and why are these things happening to me? But one of the things that about human is that our foresight is limited, and God knows our activities today affect activities and situations in the future. And had Naomi not become a widow and lost both her sons, she would not have returned back to her. I don't believe she would have returned back to her homeland of Israel. Most people, when they immigrate to a foreign land, they stay and die in that foreign land. They rarely go back to their homeland. And so I believe that had Naomi not lost her entire family, she would not have returned back to Israel. And her returning to Israel laid the foundation for the Messiah to come through her lineage, for the greatest king of Israel, David, to come through her lineage. So for right now, she is in her situation where she is still mourning the loss of her husband, mourning the loss of her two sons, and that she left Israel with a complete family and returned only with a daughter-in-law. So she is still bitter, and so she's telling the people who came out to greet her to call her Mara, and Mara means bitter. And we saw that back in Exodus when the Israelites were whining and complaining to Moses that they were thirsty, and so they came to a water that wasn't drinkable. And so God told Moses to throw a branch into the water, and so the water became potable, but they were able to drink it. And so that water was known as Mara. If you see Mara, it means bitter. All right, so now we are at verse 21. "I went out full, and the Lord has brought me home again empty. Why then call me Naomi? See, the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has afflicted me." So the last verse says, "So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her, which returned out of the country of Moab. And they came to Bethlehem in the beginning of barley harvest." So when they came, it was harvest time. There was no famine anymore. And in chapter 2, we're going to discuss a different session how Ruth will meet her second husband, and from then on, who turned out to be a very, very wealthy man. And so she went from being a pauper. Because remember, in those days, women did not work or earn a living. So when you are a widow and didn't have children to take care of you, you were very poor. So you will see how her circumstances changed. And all because of her love for Naomi and the fact that she was sold out and she adopted Naomi's culture. She started serving the true and living God. She left her false gods behind in Moab and started serving the true and living God. And God rewarded her with being an ancestor to our Messiah, Jesus Christ. And also we will see in that chapter that Naomi, even though she was an older woman, that she turned out to still have purpose and value to contribute to this our new family. Hopefully you learn something today in terms of us as women, that when we are going through challenges or difficulties, it's for us just to trust God. It's important that we trust God, that what we are going through, for the mama to always say, if it doesn't kill you, it will make you stronger. And it's an opportunity for us to learn. It's hard to leave our comfort zone. In order for Ruth to be blessed, she had to make a move. She had to shift, and her shifting meant leaving Moab, immigrating to Israel, leaving her family, leaving her religion, everything that was familiar to her, to move to Israel, because with that move, she was able to meet and marry a very wealthy man. And as a result, through that lineage, she was the great grandmother to King David, the greatest king of Israel. And also, she was in the lineage. Jesus Christ came through that lineage of Ruth and Boaz. And so we just need to be encouraged. And when we are going through difficulty, let us realize that difficulty is temporary. One of the problems with depression is that sense of hopelessness and helplessness. And the key about depression is thinking that your situation now will be your situation forever. And that is not true. We all go through different seasons in our lives. And sometimes when we are going through certain difficulty, it's preparing us for something greater. Anything worth having, you're gonna have to have some challenges. You're gonna have to fight for it. If everything comes to you easy, it doesn't have the same value as something that you have to really work at to earn. And you will find that it's easier to spend other people's money than to spend your own hard-earned money, because you know how hard you have to work for that dollar. And so you always think twice about whether I really have to get that thing, or will this have more value and I should pay less, things like that. And so always remember that, whenever we have challenges, we are being prepared for something greater. And no matter what we are going through, that situation is not going to last forever. It's temporary. It's only for a time. And whatever we are going through, as my sister would say, this too shall pass. God bless you. Have a good evening.